Imagine a world where floods wreak havoc on cities, with cars piling up high in the streets. Hurricanes tear through towns where homes are submerged underwater. Wildfires obliterate biodiverse regions teeming with flora and fauna, and extreme heat and drought leads to mass migration, fueling global conflict and insecurity. Now understand that this isn't far-fetched, but a reality we are facing right now. Climate breakdown is here, and we need to be candid about this terrifying reality. What's even more terrifying is that this is our world at 1.5 degrees of warming, which we have surpassed for the very first time this year. Yet 1.5 seems to have become synonymous with complacency. 1.5 is a vital benchmark for so-called safe levels of warming that world leaders agreed to nearly 10 years ago at the COP21 in Paris. 1.5 is anything but safe, and world leaders are failing to achieve the bare minimum with the little time that we have left. Back in 2015, I was reassured that the world was finally on track to ensuring a habitable and prosperous future. Now I grieve this feeling, and I desperately hope for its return. But first, let me be clear. The Paris Agreement was a huge victory. But we cannot rest on the laurels of it in theory. The time for celebrations is over. We need to see it in practice. Yet our governments are not practicing what they preach. They have plans to produce 110% more fossil fuels by 2030 than what is compatible with humanity being able to survive and manage the impacts of climate change. Drill, baby, drill isn't just a political slogan. It's a commonly held policy position of so many climate leaders around the world. Fossil fuel reserves in G20 countries embed over 1 trillion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent greenhouse gases, enough to compromise not only 1.5, but a 2-degree carbon budget. These countries are on track to release 850 billion tons of carbon by 2050, putting the world on track for 2.5 degrees or above. This is a death sentence. These are the nations who boldly committed to the Paris Agreement and agreed to transition away from fossil fuels at COP28 last year. So why are their emissions allowed to rise? You see, despite being seen as the gold standard for climate, the Paris Agreement does not even mention the leading cause of these emissions, the fossil fuel trifecta of coal, oil, and gas. Fossil fuels were only mentioned for the first time in UNFCCC processes last year in Dubai. So while transitioning away from fossil fuels was a historic and important signal, it was surrounded by many loopholes, and many countries have continued with expansion. But what good is signing a treaty when many countries and companies are still allowed to expand fossil fuel production? It's not a transition if we are still growing the problem. The issue is not simply that nations are failing to adhere to the Paris Agreement, but the Paris Agreement needs a complementary framework to ensure that its vital targets are kept alive. In case it needs reiterating, fossil fuels are weapons of mass destruction, causing catastrophic climate disasters from Valencia to Bogota and fueling violence across the world from Sudan to Gaza. The science couldn't be clearer that there must be no new fossil fuel projects. But currently, there is no global framework to manage a transition away from fossil fuels. Efforts within the UNFCCC have been difficult for almost 30 years because it is a universal, consensus-based treaty. Currently, any major fossil fuel producer can block efforts to explicitly address coal, oil, and gas in current climate negotiations. This is why we urgently need a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty to help meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. A fossil fuel treaty has 3 key pillars. Number 1, end the expansion of fossil fuel extraction. 2, wind down production in keeping with the science. And 3, accelerate a global, fair and financed transition to distributed renewable and sustainable energy sources and other low-carbon solutions. And this momentum for a treaty is growing stronger by the day. We are now spearheaded by 14 countries from the Pacific, Caribbean, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. This even includes Colombia, a major fossil fuel producer, and a global movement backed by thousands of civil society organizations and institutions, including the World Health Organization, the European Parliament, faith leaders, indigenous nations across the Amazon, trade unions, academics, Nobel Prize laureates, and youth activists, including myself. 32 years ago, before I was even born, world leaders gathered here in Rio for the Earth Summit. This is where the UNFCCC and our international effort to stop climate change was born. But since then, G20 nations have extracted fossil fuels responsible for 73% of global emissions. However, with a fossil fuel treaty, we are working towards a new era where we fight to protect what we love from these threats, where we create powerful binding agreements to leave coal, oil, and gas in the ground, and where we scale international cooperation and finance to manage the transition where every worker, community, and country can flourish. The Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty offers us a path forwards and is reigniting that hope which began in Paris nearly 10 years ago. So join us in working towards keeping 1.5 alive. Thank you. Obrigada.